Week 3 delivered some amazing rugby and some heartbreak results for a couple of teams. The France versus Namibia and the England versus Chile games went the direction that you thought it would, with France and England coming away with solid victories. The biggest upset from those two games was just a loss of Dupont to the fracture that he got on his cheek, and hopefully that is one that heals in time for the quarterfinals. Both games were try-fests, and it would have just added to the confidence of both England and France. England in particular would have taken most hard from it because they've steadily been building up since the start of the World Cup. They came into the World Cup not looking good. They've not been exceptional in the first two games, but they're growing with every passing game. So they're going to throw a spanner in the work, it looks like. But let's have a look at the other games and the results that they brought us. Italy versus Uruguay was another clash where Uruguay showed that they were supposed to be at this World Cup. They dominated the first half and they were beautiful to watch. If you see the heart and the passion that they play with, it's amazing. However, Italy showed their class. Shortly after the second half, they came out like a team possessed and they just put Uruguay away. And there was no way for Uruguay to get back into it in the last couple of minutes, but it was a good effort from them. The Argentina versus Samoa game was a much closer game, but it was a game fraught with mistakes from both teams. Samoa in particular could really be upset with that result because if they hadn't made as many mistakes as they did, they could have possibly pulled off a victory and really gotten one step in the door for the quarterfinals. Georgia versus Portugal game was a very entertaining game and was actually a replay of the European finals that they had earlier this year in March. In that game, Portugal came out as the losers, but in this game, you could see that Portugal was out for revenge. And there was top quality rugby played from both teams in different parts of the game. In the end, the 18-all result was probably the right one. Feel bad for Portugal where they had the chance to win it at the death. But overall, you can see that both of these teams are really getting better. And I hope that there's a lot more growth for them in the coming weeks and months. And in the next time that the World Cup rolls around, that they are even more competitive than they are now. Then we get to the other big games in this round. First one, South Africa versus Ireland. That was a massive and brutal clash. That looked like the test rugby that I really enjoyed, with the result being exceptionally close right to the death, and nobody being 100% sure of a win for either team until that final whistle. Yes, the South Africans were brutal in the contact, and they really dominated quite a few facets in the game. The Irish team, however, took every single chance that they got. They absorbed all that pressure, and their superior technical abilities and their concentration and focus was what got them over the line. Despite the constant onslaught from the South African team, they were able to weather that storm, and they calmly waited for their opportunities and took them brilliantly. It was a brilliant game to watch. I love seeing games like this, and Ireland deserved that victory in there. Scotland versus Tonga game set the stage for a very, very weird last 2 weeks for Pool B, where a couple of different things can happen depending on the results that we see there. The Scottish were ruthless throughout most of the game there, and Finn Russell was just a magician on the field. Just those slightly delayed passes and his kicks that he put through is just on the next level. I really enjoy the way that he really dictates the way that a game runs these days. When you pair him with Duan van der Merwe and the brute force that he brings to the party, Scotland always going to be too much for the Tongan team. As I've said before, Tonga has all the personnel to really be a massive team in World Rugby. Just hope that they get the opportunities to live up to that potential by playing in more competitive games in the coming months and years, so they can just grow as a squad and they can just get better and better and better the whole time. The Wales versus Wallabies team was just a clinical demolition of the Wallabies team by the Welsh, and yeah, there's not much positive that can be said about the Wallabies team in this game, sadly. Wallabies are in a world of hurt. And ex-players like David Campese said overall of Australian rugby is needed. Some of the players also said that Super Rugby needs to be scaled down with less Australian teams, but a couple of really strong Australian teams competing in Super Rugby. At the moment, this is something that's a big issue. Actually, in years gone by, if you have a look back at some of the glory years where the Brumbies used to dominate Super Rugby, there was actually a period where they only played with three teams, three or four, but they only played with a few teams in Super Rugby at the time, and that actually allowed them to be far stronger than what they have currently. Too many teams spread too thin. Wales are, however, growing in stature, and they were able to get past Fiji and the onslaught that they had to endure there, and they've just been growing steadily in stature. So it would be interesting to see where Wales actually ends up from the quarterfinals onward. But they're not going to be an easy one to get past. So that leads us to the first couple of interesting scenarios that can play out during the rest of the World Cup. First off, Italy has a chance to actually get into the quarterfinals. That is also something that nobody ever thought we would say at all about Italy. But Italy have the most difficult path of all. They have to either pull off a shocking victory against France or a shocking victory against New Zealand, both of which are a tall order at this point. Although they are second in the group, just getting bonus point losses will not be enough. They need to pick up one of those shock victories. This weekend will also be the decider in most ways for what happens in Pool B. The South Africa versus Tonga game will be an interesting one to watch, and Scotland can really throw a spanner in the works based on how they perform against Romania. They put up a big score. There will be a lot of stress on South Africa's shoulders, and it would be interesting to see how that affects them and if they're actually able to absorb that pressure and those levels of stress. If South Africa, however, come away with a strong victory against Tonga, they just about punch their ticket into the quarterfinals. If Scotland come away with a very strong victory, they've still got a mathematical chance, and that last game against Ireland is going to be extremely interesting to see. In Pool C, Fiji would need to lose either against Georgia or Portugal, and I don't see that happening. If they lose to both, then Australia kind of have a chance to still get into the quarterfinals, but that is not going to happen. In Pool D, things are, however, very exciting, with 2 teams on 5 points and 1 on 4 points, and all of those teams have played 2 games. The 3 teams that I'm talking about there are Japan and Samoa and Argentina, of course. What makes it really interesting, though, is that all 3 teams have both had good performances and they've looked flawed. So, depending on how they handle the next couple of games, will be very interesting to see who really wants that second quarterfinal spot. And it's going to be some brutal fights that we'll be seeing, which I'm really looking forward to. And that kind of brings us to our biggest winners first of this past weekend, and then the biggest losers that we'll end up with. Now, in terms of the biggest winners, I have to give an honourable mention to Georgia and Portugal and the way in which they played. They have really shown that they belong at this World Cup and that they are teams for the future. And I hope that they get the chance to grow as rugby nations through some more competitive games in the coming years. England also took another big step forward as a squad, coming from the way that they looked just prior to the tournament, picking up their first 2 victories and now a confidence boosting big one. They've punched their ticket into the quarterfinals, and from there we know anything can happen. Wales, they were also ruthless. They just put the Wallabies to bed with that 46 victory, and they also entered the quarterfinals, which is well deserved. Biggest winner on the weekend, however, definitely Ireland. You have to give it to them. They were accurate when they needed to be, and they were an example of how you take some of the sting out of that very dominant South African pack. Biggest losers on the weekend, we have to start with Tonga and Samoa. And it's not that I'm trying to be nasty mentioning them. The only reason that they are in kind of my third place in terms of the biggest losers for the weekend is that they've got all those amazing athletes. They just don't have the team in place yet to back that up, which is very sad to see. I do hope that World Rugby continues to support them and helps their development and growth. World Rugby did step in about a year ago to help these teams prepare for the World Cup, but this kind of support needs to happen every single year, not just in a World Cup year. South Africa, they come in second place. They were brutal, but they were flawed. They conceded penalties way too often, and they weren't able to convert when they were close to the line. They had the patience of Ireland in those kind of situations. we would have seen a couple of tries coming from the South African team, and that game would have been a lot different. But they didn't, and they need to learn from it. The second thing is you can't look past it, is the kicking. When you're playing at this level, you should have been kicking at 80% success rate. Now, the only 80% that was happening here was the 80% of kicks that were being missed by the team. So this weekend, a lot of pressure is going to be probably on Pollard's shoulders to try and turn that one around. But South Africa, yeah, at times really good, at times really bad in that game. So there's work for them to do heading into this coming weekend. Then the biggest loser of the lot, sadly, that goes to Australia. They were crushed. And they were only a shadow of the Wallaby team of years gone by. This is the first time actually that the Wallabies don't go through to the quarterfinals at a World Cup since the start of the World Cup, and that is very, very sad to see. The Wallabies are usually in there in the mix. Sometimes they are amazing, sometimes they're just a little off the pace, but they're always there. But this time around, they were nowhere. It's a very young squad though, and I hope that as some reforms happen in Australia, that they don't get rid of these players. If they keep these players as a core, they would be able to actually to build a solid team heading into the next World Cup. And that is something that can make it very interesting from there. But that's the wrap for week 3. Let's look forward to week 4. It's going to be interesting.